They said it calmly, not angry, not shouting, just one sentence. You're old enough to handle things on your own now. People hear that and think it means strength. What it really meant for me was this: no bed to sleep in, no place to go, and no one responsible anymore. That night, the desert wind was louder than any argument, and I learned something most people never talk about sometimes. Independence is just a nicer word for abandonment. If this already hits close to home, stay with me. Like the video. Share it with someone who needs it. And don't forget to subscribe, because this story goes much deeper than it sounds. I used to think our house was normal. Not happy, not warm, just normal enough. From the outside, it probably looked fine. A quiet place at the edge of town. Dinner on the table most nights. No shouting that the neighbors could hear. Inside, everything felt slightly off, like furniture pushed a few inches out of place, but no one admitting it. I was the quiet one, the kind of kid teachers described as no trouble. I apologized too much, even when I wasn't sure what I'd done wrong. I assumed I had. If something went missing, I checked my pockets first. If someone was upset, I replayed my day in my head, looking for the mistake. Blaming myself became automatic. It felt safer than asking questions. My father, Daniel, avoided conflict the way some people avoid bad weather. If tension entered the room, he'd suddenly have work to finish, or errands to run, or silence to hide behind. He wasn't cruel. He just wasn't there when it mattered. Rebecca, my older sister, fit perfectly into the space I never could. She knew when to speak. She knew when to smile. She knew what adults wanted to hear. If there was a right role to play, she played it well. And if there was attention to be earned, it somehow landed on her. I learned early that staying invisible kept things calm. So I stayed quiet, stayed small, stayed out of the way. My grandmother, Evelyn, lived a few towns over. She visited on holidays, brought food we couldn't pronounce, watched more than she spoke. When she hugged me, she held on a second longer than necessary, like she was trying to remember something important. Or warn me. Most days passed without incident. That was the problem. Nothing was loud enough to call abuse. Nothing was obvious enough to complain about. Just a slow shift where the house stopped feeling like a place I belonged. That's when the words started showing up. The reasonable ones. You're old enough to understand. You're mature for your age. You can handle more than other kids. They sounded like compliments. People said them with nods, with approval. What no one explained was the hidden meaning. Being old enough didn't come with more support. It came with less protection, less patience, less responsibility from the adults in the room. When something felt unfair, I was told to be understanding. When something hurt, I was told to be strong. When something crossed a line, I was told not to make it worse. That's the trap no one warns you about. When adults say a child is grown, it often means they're stepping back. Quietly, conveniently. They don't say, I can't handle this. They say, you'll be fine. And suddenly, a kid is expected to carry things their nervous system was never built for. Adult decisions, adult consequences, adult silence. I didn't know any of that back then. I just knew the house felt colder. Not physically, emotionally. I started spending more time in my room, reading library books I didn't fully understand, doing homework twice, just in case. At dinner, conversations happened over my head. Decisions were made without me. I nodded when spoken to. If you had asked me then if I felt unsafe, I would have said no, because nothing bad had happened yet. But safety isn't only about danger. It's about knowing someone will stand between you and it. And in that house, that role was slowly disappearing. I remember standing in the kitchen one night, staring at the fridge. It was almost empty. Not because we didn't have food, because no one had thought about it. That's when it hit me. Not all neglect is dramatic. Some of it is quiet, administrative, passed off as independence. You start managing yourself before you even realize you shouldn't have to. Looking back, the signs were everywhere. I just didn't have the language for them. I thought being tired all the time meant I was lazy. I thought feeling anxious meant I was weak. I thought keeping the peace was my responsibility. No one corrected me. That's how a home stops being a place you return to and starts becoming a place you tiptoe through. By the time things finally broke, the distance was already there, built slowly, brick by brick, with reasonable words and calm voices. And when the moment came that everyone remembers, it didn't feel sudden to me at all. It felt like the natural conclusion to a house that had stopped protecting its youngest long before anyone noticed. I didn't know it yet, but I had already been living like I was on my own. The paper was already on the table when I walked in. Not a letter, not a note. Just a few printed pages with a line at the bottom for my name. Daniel didn't raise his voice. That was the strange part. He said this wasn't a punishment. He said it was a boundary. He said it was for my own good. The words sounded calm, reasonable, almost professional. He explained that I needed to take responsibility, that I needed to learn consequences, that I was old enough now to handle things on my own. I remember staring at the page, trying to understand what I was being asked to agree to. It said I would leave the house voluntarily, that no one was forcing me, that this was a mutual decision. If you were me, would you have known what that meant? I asked where I was supposed to go. Daniel said we'd figure that out later. He said this wasn't about logistics. It was about discipline. Rebecca stood in the doorway, quiet, watching, not surprised. No one explained what I had done that required this level of discipline. No timeline, no chance to fix it, just a decision already made. I held the pen with both hands because my fingers wouldn't stop shaking. The room felt smaller than it had a minute earlier. They weren't yelling, they weren't angry, and somehow that made it worse, because anger would have meant emotion. Emotion would have meant care. This felt like administration. I signed because everyone was waiting, because silence filled the room like pressure, because saying no didn't feel like an option. The moment the pen left the paper, something shifted, not in them, in me. That was the first time I realized how thin the line is between discipline and abandonment. Discipline is supposed to keep a child inside the circle. It means rules, consequences, guidance. It means the adult stays. Abandonment does the opposite. It removes the adult. It removes protection, then calls the removal a lesson. I didn't know those words back then. I just knew I felt alone. They kept saying this was to teach me responsibility. But no one asked if I was safe. No one asked if I had a plan. No one asked if I was scared. Responsibility, it turns out, can be used as a cover, a way to step back without admitting you're stepping away. If you've ever been told you were mature for your age, you might recognize this. It sounds like praise, but it often comes with a cost. Being mature didn't get me more support. It got me less patience, less protection, less room to be confused or afraid. I was expected to understand decisions that were made without me, to accept consequences I didn't cause, to manage emotions that weren't mine. That's not growth, that's displacement. I remember packing my things slowly, even though no one told me to hurry. There wasn't much to take. A few clothes, a notebook, library books I hadn't finished. I opened the fridge before I left. It was almost empty. Not because we didn't have food, because no one had thought about it. That image stayed with me longer than the argument ever did. When people talk about abandonment, they imagine drama, doors slamming, screaming, running away. Sometimes it looks like a printed agreement and a calm explanation. Sometimes it's an adult saying, "This is for your own good," while stepping aside. I didn't cry when I left. I focused on not dropping anything. I told myself this was my fault, that if I'd been better, quieter, easier, none of this would be happening. That belief followed me for years. I blame myself for not understanding sooner, for not fighting harder, for not being the kind of kid worth staying for. No one corrected that story. That's the part people miss. Children don't need dramatic harm to be wounded. They just need the adults around them to stop standing between them and the world. If you were me, would you have called it abandonment back then, or would you have called it what they called it? Discipline, independence, a lesson. I didn't learn independence that day. I learned that safety could be withdrawn without warning. I learned that calm voices can still do damage, that paperwork can hurt, that being told you're old enough can mean no one plans to catch you if you fall. And once that line is crossed, it's hard to unsee it. Because after that moment, every rule feels temporary, every promise feels conditional, every home feels like it could disappear with one conversation. That's not a lesson. That's a fracture, and the consequences of that kind of fracture don't show up right away. They show up later, when you hesitate to ask for help, when you assume you're on your own, when alone starts to feel normal. I didn't know it then. I just knew the house behind me had stopped being a place that would protect me, and nothing anyone said afterward could change that. The first time I realized Rebecca could bend a room without raising her voice was the week after I signed that paper. Nothing changed on the outside. Same mornings, same dinner table, same quiet house. But the air felt different, like every sentence had a second meaning. Daniel started speaking to me like I was a guest, polite, brief, careful. He didn't ask how school was. He asked what time I'd be back. He didn't say, "Are you okay?" He said, "Let's not make this harder than it has to be." I started noticing small things. My email stopped working one morning. I tried logging in before class, and the password didn't match. I thought I'd typed it wrong. Then I tried again, and again. The screen kept flashing the same message: invalid credentials. At lunch, my friend texted me a screenshot. It was a group chat I'd been in for months. My name was gone. Not removed by me, removed by someone else. I went to the school computer lab after classes and asked the counselor's assistant for help. She pulled up my account. Her eyebrows lifted. She said, "That's odd. Your emergency contact was updated yesterday." I felt my stomach drop. It wasn't my grandmother's number anymore. It wasn't even Daniel's. It was Rebecca's. If you were me, what would you think in that moment? I walked home with my backpack heavy on one shoulder, like it always was. The sky was clear. The heat was still sitting on the pavement. Nothing looked like a crisis, but my body already knew something was wrong. Rebecca was in the kitchen when I got back. She didn't look surprised to see me. She was calm in a way that felt practiced, like she'd rehearsed her face. She asked how my day was. Then she said, "Oh, by the way, your school called. They said you've been having some issues." I said, "What issues?" She shrugged like it didn't matter. She said, "You know, the usual. You've seemed unstable." Unstable. It was such a clean word, such a convenient word. It didn't accuse me of anything specific. It just made me sound unsafe. I told Daniel my school account had been changed. He looked up from his phone for half a second. He said, "Rebecca was just trying to help. She's good with that stuff." Then he went back to scrolling. That was the moment I understood what silence can be. Not the kind of silence that comes from confusion, the kind that comes from choosing a side without saying it out loud. Rebecca didn't have to fight me. She didn't have to prove anything. She just needed to be the one Daniel believed first. And she was. After that, the stories started shifting. Rebecca would say something happened. Daniel would repeat it later like he'd witnessed it himself. Rebecca would claim I said something cruel. Daniel would look at me like I'd already confessed. I'd try to defend myself. And the more I explained, the worse it sounded. Because explaining made me look guilty. It was like the house had its own script now, and I hadn't been given a copy. One night at dinner, Daniel mentioned a missing envelope. I hadn't seen any envelope. I didn't even know what he was talking about. Rebecca took a slow sip of water and said, "It's fine. We don't need to talk about it." That was her move. She didn't accuse me directly. She planted the shape of an accusation and let Daniel fill in the rest. Daniel didn't ask questions. He didn't ask for details. He just got quiet. And in our house, quiet meant guilty. If you've ever lived with a golden child, you know the feeling. They don't need evidence. They have momentum. They are the one who's always been responsible, the one who would never lie. They learn early what gets praised and what gets punished. Rebecca wasn't free. She was trained, loved when she played the role, rewarded when she protected the image of the family. And when you grow up like that, truth becomes flexible. Not because you're born cruel, because you learn that being believed matters more than being honest. The more the family relies on you as the good one, the more you fear losing that spot. And if someone threatens it, even by simply existing, you don't see them as a person. You see them as risk. I think that's the part people don't understand. They ask, how could a sister do that? But they're picturing sisters in the same family, equal ground, equal protection. That wasn't our reality. Rebecca was protected. I was tolerated. And when a family gets used to protecting one person, it becomes automatic, like a reflex. That's how manipulation works best. Not loud, not dramatic, quiet, systematic. One little change at a time. A password here, a contact update there, a whispered story over dinner. Then the consequences start piling up. My teachers started looking at me differently. Not everyone. Just enough to make me doubt myself. One of them pulled me aside after class and asked if things were okay at home, not in a warm way, in a careful way, like I was a problem they were preparing for. I started carrying my notebook everywhere, not for homework, for notes, dates, times, what was said, who was in the room, because I could feel reality slipping. And I didn't trust anyone else to hold it still. That was the strange part. I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to stay sane. That's what gaslighting does. It doesn't just make you look bad. It makes you question your own memory. Daniel watched all of this happen and did nothing. He'd hear a contradiction and change the subject. He'd notice a lie and pretend he didn't. People like to think silence is neutral. It isn't. Silence is a decision. Silence has consequences. Every time Daniel looked away, Rebecca got bolder, and every time he called it keeping the peace, I got more alone. I tried once more to talk to him. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I said, "Something isn't right." He didn't ask what I meant. He just said, "Maya, please. I can't deal with more drama." Drama. That word did what Rebecca's word had done. It turned my reality into a personality flaw. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of my bed with my notebook open. I wrote one line that night and underlined it twice. If I don't record the truth, someone else will rewrite it. And once they rewrite it, they'll punish me for a story I didn't even tell. I didn't know how far Rebecca would take it yet. I just knew the silence in that house wasn't empty anymore. It was aimed. I didn't leave in a dramatic way. No shouting, no slammed door. I just walked out with my bag and my notebook, like I was going to the library. The sky had been clear an hour earlier. Out here, that didn't mean much. The wind changed first. It started pushing dust along the road in thin, nervous lines. Then the air dropped a few degrees. Fast. I kept telling myself I had time, that I'd find a place, that an adult would notice and fix this. But every mile I walked made it feel less like a mistake and more like a decision. I headed toward the highway because it was the only direction that made sense. The town was small. The roads didn't offer a lot of choices. There weren't sidewalks out there. Just gravel and weeds and a strip of shoulder that felt too narrow for the speed of passing cars. The first truck that flew by rocked my whole body with wind. I stumbled and caught myself, heart pounding. I looked down at my hands. My fingers were already stiff. I pulled my sleeves over them, even though it didn't help much. My phone was dead, not broken, just dead. The kind of dead that feels personal when you're alone. I tried turning it on anyway. 1%, then nothing. I walked faster after that. The wind picked up like it had a purpose. It pressed against my face and made my eyes water. When the first pieces of hail started hitting the ground, I didn't even understand what it was at first. They sounded like tiny rocks. Then one hit my shoulder hard enough to sting through my hoodie. Another bounced off my backpack. The storm wasn't pretty. It wasn't cinematic. It was loud and sharp and cold in a way that made my thoughts slow down. I hunched forward and kept walking. My sneakers soaked through quickly. Hail turned to slush in the dirt. The shoulder became slick. Every step felt heavier than the last. If you were me, what would you do? I considered knocking on doors. But there weren't houses close by. Just darkness. Empty lots. A few trailers set back behind fences I couldn't even see clearly in the blowing dust. I thought about calling Evelyn. Then I remembered my emergency contact had been changed. My email had been wiped. Even my school account didn't feel like mine anymore. It hit me in a way that made my stomach twist. This wasn't just about me leaving the house. It was about me being erased. That's a different kind of fear. Not the fear of getting in trouble. The fear of disappearing while people still think everything is fine. I kept checking my notebook like it was a compass. Dates. Times. Notes. My handwriting was shaky from the cold. But I needed to hold on to something that proved I was real. A car slowed down once. Headlights cut through the hail, bright and harsh. The driver rolled the window down an inch. He asked if I needed help. My throat tightened. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to climb into the warmth without thinking. But then my brain did what it always did. It reminded me of every warning I'd ever heard. Don't get into a stranger's car. Don't trust anyone. Be careful. So I said no. And the car drove away. As the taillights disappeared, I felt my chest go hollow. I wasn't just alone. I was alone with rules that were designed for kids who still had adults watching over them. That's another thing people don't talk about. Safety rules assume you have a safe place to return to. I didn't. The hail got worse. It started hitting my cheeks, my ears, my knuckles. I pulled my hood tighter, but the wind kept ripping it back. My teeth started chattering so hard it hurt my jaw. I tried counting my breaths to stay calm. In, out, in, out. It didn't help. My thoughts started slipping. Not mentally, like panic. Physically, like my brain was saving power. I stopped feeling scared. That was the scary part. I started feeling slow. My legs moved like they belonged to someone else. My hands didn't feel like hands. They felt like something I was carrying. I finally saw the outline of a building ahead. A gas station. Or what used to be one. The sign was half lit and buzzing. The parking lot was cracked. The windows looked dusty. But it was shelter. I crossed the lot with my head down, fighting the wind like it was an opponent. The door was locked. I pulled on it anyway. Once. Twice. Nothing. My stomach dropped. I pressed my forehead against the glass and looked inside. Empty shelves, dark aisles, a counter with a faded lottery sign. No lights. I tried the door again. Harder. My hands slipped on the handle because they were wet and numb. I started banging with my shoulder. Not because I thought someone would open it, because I needed to do something. The hail kept hitting my back. The wind screamed through the gaps around the building like it was laughing. I slid down the wall and sat on the concrete, pulling my knees to my chest. My backpack was soaked. My notebook was damp at the edges. The ink on one page had smeared. That felt like losing evidence. I held the notebook against my hoodie like I could keep it alive. My phone was still dead. My fingers were too numb to even try again. I watched the road, waiting for headlights. One car passed without slowing, then another. Each time, the sound of tires on wet pavement came and went like a reminder. People were out there. Life was still happening. I just wasn't part of it. I thought about Daniel, warm inside the house, calling this a lesson. I thought about Rebecca, probably calm, probably certain the story was already working. And I thought about how easy it would be for everyone to say later, we thought she was fine, because that's what happens when a child is made to look independent. You don't have to protect them. You can just assume they'll figure it out. The cold spread through my body in waves. First my hands, then my feet, then my core. I started shivering less. That should have scared me more. I tried to stand, and my knees didn't listen right away. I pressed my palm to the wall to steady myself. My vision felt narrow. I remember thinking one clear thought, like a sentence floating in dark water. If I fall asleep out here, no one will know where I went. No one will know what really happened. And that's when I realized the most dangerous part of that night wasn't the storm. It was the fact that I had been pushed outside the circle of care. Not just emotionally, systemically. Alone isn't just a feeling. Sometimes it's a status. And once you become that status, the consequences come fast. I don't remember falling asleep. I remember light, white and sharp, cutting through the dark, a door opening, voices that didn't belong to the storm. When I came back to myself, I was sitting on the floor inside the gas station office, not the store, the back room. Someone had found a way in, a maintenance door, a radio call I never heard. My shoes were off. My socks were stiff with cold. My notebook was still in my hands. A man wrapped a blanket around my shoulders without asking. Another held a cup close to my mouth and told me to sip. I didn't cry. I just stared at the floor and focused on staying awake. Later, someone asked my name, then my age. That's when everything slowed down. A uniformed officer crouched in front of me, so we were at eye level. His name was Moore. I remember because he made sure I heard it. He didn't rush. He didn't lecture. He asked simple questions, where I came from, how long I'd been out there. I told him the truth, the way it had happened, no drama, no exaggeration. I'd been asked to leave. I'd left. I had nowhere to go. He didn't react right away. He just nodded and wrote things down. That was the first time the story stopped being about feelings. It became about time. Officer Moore asked what time I left the house. I checked my notebook. He asked what time I reached the highway. I checked again. He asked where I'd been found. Then he asked a question I wasn't expecting. Do you know there's a camera outside this station? I looked up at him for the first time. He pointed toward the corner of the ceiling. A small black dome I hadn't noticed. He said it recorded everything. Time-stamped. Automatically saved. Evidence. That word felt heavy. Different from everything else that night. He stepped outside to make a call. While he was gone, I watched the steam rise from my socks as they dried near a space heater. My hands were starting to feel like hands again. I realized something then. All night, I'd been explaining myself, justifying my existence, trying to sound believable. But cameras don't care how you sound. They only care what happened. Officer Moore came back in with a different posture, straighter, more certain. He said the footage showed me arriving hours earlier, alone, in the storm. He said it matched my notes, almost exactly. He didn't say it like a victory. He said it like a fact. And facts change things. He asked for my father's number. I gave it to him, even though my chest tightened when I did. The call didn't last long. I didn't hear what Daniel said. I only saw Officer Moore's face change. The calm disappeared, replaced by something firmer. Consequences. That's when I understood something no one had ever explained to me before. Adults can ignore stories. They can debate emotions. They can dismiss pain as misunderstanding. But evidence forces a response. It creates a record. It turns. I didn't know until you should have. Officer Moore told me to wait while he made another call. Child services, paperwork. Words that sound boring until you realize they mean someone has to answer for what happened. I sat there wrapped in a blanket that smelled like detergent and oil, listening to the heater click on and off. For the first time since I left the house, I wasn't alone in the room, and I wasn't responsible for fixing this. That mattered. Later, I learned more details. The gas station camera wasn't the only one. There were traffic cameras, timestamps, weather reports, a timeline that didn't care about family harmony, a timeline that showed a miner walking alone on a highway during a severe storm. No explanation softened that. No story could make it reasonable. That's the thing about evidence. It doesn't attack. It doesn't accuse. It just sits there and waits. I was given dry clothes, a place to sleep. Someone sat outside the door all night so I wouldn't wake up alone. In the morning, Officer Moore came back with a folder under his arm. He said they'd reviewed the agreement I'd signed. He said it didn't matter. A piece of paper doesn't cancel responsibility. Consent doesn't count when the power imbalance is this big. I didn't know that. No one had told me that. All this time, I thought being calm and cooperative was the only way to survive. I thought if I explained myself clearly enough, someone would eventually listen. But clarity doesn't protect you. Records do. I thought about Rebecca then, about how carefully she'd managed words, accounts, access. It worked until it didn't. Because systems aren't built on personality. They're built on documentation. Officer Moore didn't ask me how I felt about my family. He didn't ask if I forgave anyone. He asked questions that had answers. Where? When? How long? And for the first time, those answers mattered more than anyone's version of me. That's when the power shifted. Not because someone believed me, because the truth had been recorded. I didn't feel relief right away. I felt something quieter. Stability, the kind that comes when the ground stops moving under your feet. If you were me, would you have known this was possible? That the moment evidence enters the room, Silence loses its grip. That adults who hide behind confusion suddenly speak very clearly. That accountability doesn't arrive through emotion, it arrives through proof. I lay back on the narrow cot and stared at the ceiling, listening to the building wake up around me, cars pulling in, doors opening, morning happening. My notebook was on the table beside me, still damp, but legible. I'd written things down because I was afraid of being erased. I didn't know then that those notes, combined with a camera and a timeline, would become something bigger, a record. And once a record exists, consequences follow, not immediately, not gently, but inevitably. That was the moment the story stopped being mine to defend and started being something no one could quietly bury anymore. I found out the truth a week later. Not all of it, just enough. Officer Moore came back with the same folder, thicker this time, more papers, more tabs. He didn't sit down right away. He stood near the door and checked something on his phone. Then he said, "Your father has already been contacted before that night." I didn't understand what he meant at first. He explained slowly, carefully. There had been a call from the school 2 days earlier. Concerns, inconsistencies. They'd asked Daniel to come in, to talk. Daniel hadn't gone. Instead, he'd said everything was handled at home. That sentence stayed with me. Handled. Officer Moore said there were emails, too. Short ones, formal, requests for clarification, requests for follow-up. Daniel had replied to one of them, just one. He wrote that I was staying with friends and that the situation was under control. I felt my chest tighten. If you were me, what would you be thinking right then? Because in that moment, the story shifted. This wasn't a man who didn't know. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't ignorance. He knew enough to respond. He just chose not to act. Officer Moore kept talking, but my mind was stuck on one detail. 2 days. That meant when I signed that paper, when I walked out into the storm, Daniel already had warnings, already had context. He didn't stop it. He let it happen. I asked Officer Moore why no one stepped in sooner. He didn't blame anyone directly. He just said systems move slowly when adults sound confident. When a parent speaks calmly, professionals hesitate. They document. They wait. Silence buys time, and time can do damage. That was the moment I understood the real twist of my story. Rebecca wasn't the most dangerous person in the house. She manipulated. She rewrote. She erased. But she didn't have authority. Daniel did. And authority plus silence is a powerful combination. Later, I saw the notes myself. Redacted sections, highlighted timestamps. There was a line that said, "Father declined further discussion." Declined. Like it was a meeting he didn't have time for. Like my safety was optional. I remembered all the moments he'd looked away, all the times he'd said, "Let's not make this worse." He wasn't avoiding drama. He was avoiding responsibility. People like to believe silence is neutral, that doing nothing means you didn't choose a side. But silence always protects someone, and it's rarely the person without power. Daniel didn't need to lie. That's what made it easy. He just needed to not correct the story Rebecca was telling, not interrupt the assumptions, not open the door. And by doing that, he let the consequences fall on me. I thought back to the night I left, how calm he'd been, how steady his voice sounded. That wasn't control. That was detachment. Officer Moore said something else that stuck with me. He said, "When someone has the power to intervene and doesn't, that choice becomes part of the harm." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize it. He just wrote it down. Silence. Documented. Stops being invisible. It turns into evidence. Daniel was asked to come in after that. This time, he didn't decline. The tone of the calls changed. So did the paperwork. People often ask if I felt vindicated. I didn't. I felt something colder. Clarity. Because the story wasn't about a bad sister anymore. It was about a father who chose comfort over protection. And once that clicked, a lot of things made sense. Why Rebecca felt safe escalating, why my words never landed, why the house had gone quiet in a very specific way. Silence wasn't an accident, it was a strategy. And like all strategies, it had a cost. I wasn't in the room when Daniel was told about the footage, the timeline, the storm warnings. But Officer Moore told me what happened. He said Daniel's face changed when he realized there was a record, that the story had moved past conversation, that there were now consequences. It wasn't fear I imagined on Daniel's face. It was calculation failing. That's what evidence does. It removes the option to stay vague. I didn't feel triumph hearing that. I felt tired. Because I understood then that my safety had never been misunderstood. It had been deprioritized. And that's harder to forgive than a lie. If you were me, what would hurt more? Being attacked openly, or realizing the person who could have stopped it early chose not to? That kind of realization doesn't come with yelling or tears. It arrives quietly, like a file sliding across a desk, like a sentence written down that can't be erased. Silence has a cost, not always immediate, not always visible. But once the truth is recorded, silence stops being passive. It becomes proof of complicity, and proof doesn't care about intent. It only cares about what happened. The first time Daniel asked to see me, it wasn't dramatic. It came through a social worker, a voicemail on a borrowed phone, a calm message with careful words. Your father would like to meet. He says he wants to talk. I was sitting on the edge of a twin bed in a temporary room that didn't smell like me. My clothes were folded in stacks that weren't mine. My notebook was on the nightstand like a security blanket. I listened to the voicemail twice. Then I stared at the wall for a long time. If you were me, what would you do with that request? People think the hardest part of a story like this is the storm, or the night outside, or the paperwork. But the hardest part is when the person who hurt you asks to come back into your life like it's a simple conversation. Like what happened was an argument, not a fracture. I didn't hate Daniel. That was the part that confused people. I wasn't burning with rage. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was just clear. Clarity is different than anger. Anger wants movement. Clarity wants distance. The social worker asked if I wanted to meet him in a supervised room. Neutral location. Short visit. She said it could be healing. I asked her a question instead. What exactly is he apologizing for? She paused. She said he didn't give details. He just said he was sorry. That answer told me everything. Because sorry, without specifics, is not an apology. It's a request. A request to be released from discomfort. I didn't want his discomfort to be my responsibility again. So I said no, not loudly, not angrily. I just said, I'm not meeting him. The social worker looked surprised. She didn't argue. She just nodded and wrote something down. I went back to my room and opened my notebook. I flipped to the page where I'd written the timeline. Dates, times, the storm, the gas station camera, Officer Moore's name, evidence. That word kept coming back. Evidence of what happened. Evidence of what wasn't done. I realized then that Daniel wanted a meeting because meetings feel human. They feel soft. A meeting allows tears, a handshake, a story. A meeting makes it easier for someone to say, "We both made mistakes." But we didn't both make mistakes. One person had power. One person was a child. One person could have stopped it early. One person couldn't. That isn't equal. So instead of meeting him, I wrote a letter the way I wrote my notes. Clear, specific, not poetic, not cruel, just true. I said, "I'm not coming back." I said, "I'm not meeting you right now." And then I said the sentence I'd never said out loud before. "I forgive you, but I won't return to the place where you didn't protect me." I didn't write that for him. I wrote it for me. Because forgiveness, the real kind, isn't a doorway for someone else. It's a door you close correctly. People mix up forgiveness with reunion. They think forgiving means you're saying it wasn't that bad, or that you've moved on so completely it won't matter if it happens again. That's not forgiveness. That's denial. Forgiveness, for me, was simpler. It was choosing to stop carrying his choices in my body. It was choosing not to rehearse that night every time the wind picked up. It was choosing not to let my life revolve around his guilt. I could let go of the anger without handing him access. I could release myself without returning. That's what people don't teach you. They teach you to forgive like it's a gift you owe someone to prove you're a good person. But forgiveness isn't earned by the person who caused the harm. It's claimed by the person who survived it, and it comes with boundaries. A boundary is not revenge. It's not cruelty. It's a refusal to repeat a pattern. Daniel wrote back. Not immediately. A few weeks later, his handwriting was tight, like he was trying to keep control even on paper. He said he didn't know how things got so bad. He said he was trying to keep the family together. He said he was scared of losing everything. He used a lot of words, but he still didn't name the specific thing he did. He didn't write. "I let you walk into a storm." He didn't write. "I ignored warnings." He didn't write. "I chose silence." He wrote around it, like if he avoided the center, he could avoid the weight. I folded his letter and put it back in the envelope. Then I did something that felt small, but mattered more than anything. I didn't reread it. I didn't analyze it. I didn't try to turn it into closure. I just placed it in a drawer and closed it. That was my closure. Not because I didn't care, because I finally cared about myself more. If you were me, would you feel guilty for that? A lot of people do. They think boundaries mean you're bitter. They think distance means you're unforgiving. But distance is sometimes the healthiest form of honesty. It says, "I see what happened." It says, "I respect the consequences." It says, "I'm not pretending this didn't change me," and it did change me. I stopped waiting for the perfect apology. I stopped hoping someone would finally explain why I wasn't protected. I stopped asking my past to behave differently so my future could feel safe. That's what forgiveness looked like for me. Not a reunion, not a new beginning with the same people, a quiet ending, a clean line, a decision that said I can be kind without returning. I can forgive without reopening the door. I can let go without going back. And once I understood that, something inside me finally unclenched. Not because Daniel became better, but because I stopped letting his silence define my life. People kept telling me how strong I was. They said it like it explained everything. "You're so mature for your age. You handled that better than most adults. You grew up fast." At first, I took it as a compliment. It felt better than asking why I had to grow up at all. But over time, those words started to sound different. They sounded like excuses. Excuses for why no one stepped in sooner. Excuses for why I was expected to manage things that shouldn't have been mine. I started noticing how often this happens. When a child doesn't cry, people call them resilient. When a child takes care of themselves, People call them independent. When a child stops asking for help, people call them strong. Rarely do they ask what made that necessary. I looked back at my own story with new eyes. The nights I stayed quiet so no one would get angry. The way I learned to read moods instead of homework. The habit of blaming myself before anyone else could. That wasn't maturity. That was adaptation. Children don't grow up early because they want to. They do it because something is missing: protection, consistency, someone who will say, "This isn't yours to carry." When those things disappear, children fill the gap, and then we praise them for it. I started hearing my story echoed in other people's lives. Friends who became the responsible one after a parent checked out. Classmates who cooked dinner every night at 12. Co-workers who never ask for help and don't know how to rest. Different backgrounds. Same pattern. Early competence is often grief in disguise. It's the body learning survival before it learns safety. I realized how dangerous the word mature can be when it's used on a child, because it shifts responsibility. If a child is mature, then adults feel less urgency, less obligation, less guilt. Maturity becomes a reason to step back. But real maturity isn't about coping alone. It's about knowing when you're supported enough to take risks. What I was praised for wasn't maturity. It was endurance. And endurance should never be confused with well-being. I thought about the systems that failed me. School staff who hesitated because my father sounded calm. Neighbors who didn't question the story because I didn't look distressed. Adults who assumed that because I was quiet, I was fine. Silence looks like stability from the outside. That's another trap. Children who are falling apart loudly get noticed. Children who fall apart quietly get labeled easy. Easy children are often the most alone. I don't blame every adult who missed the signs, but I do question a culture that celebrates independence in children without asking why it's necessary. We talk a lot about raising strong kids. We talk less about being strong enough adults to stay present. Because staying present is uncomfortable. It means conflict. It means accountability. It means not hiding behind words like discipline or tough love. It means choosing protection even when it's inconvenient. I learned that growing up too fast comes with long-term costs. You become hyper-aware, hyper-responsible. You scan for danger even in safe rooms. You don't trust support because it's always felt temporary. And later, people wonder why you struggle to rest, why you don't ask for help, why you feel guilty when you're not useful. Those patterns don't come from personality. They come from necessity. I stopped calling my younger self strong. I started calling her unsupported. That shift changed everything. It let me release the pride I'd wrapped around my pain, because pride can be a shield, and sometimes shields prevent healing. If you were me, would you have recognized that sooner, or would you also have mistaken survival for strength? I don't think the answer is to make children weaker. I think the answer is to stop using their competence as an excuse. A child being capable does not mean they don't need protection. A child being calm does not mean they aren't hurting. A child being mature does not mean they should be left to figure things out alone. We need to stop rewarding early adulthood in children when it's born from neglect. We need to stop telling kids they're impressive for carrying weight that never belonged to them. Because every time we do, we normalize the absence of care, and the consequences show up years later in adults who don't know how to receive, in adults who apologize for having needs, in adults who feel safest when they're alone. I didn't become who I am because I was strong. I became who I am because I had to survive. Those are not the same thing. And once I understood that, I stopped feeling proud of what I endured. I started feeling clear about what should never have been required. Growing up early is not an achievement. It's a signal. and it's one we should learn to take seriously. If you've listened this far, I want to ask you something. Not as a lesson, not as advice, just a question. If you were me, what would you still be carrying? I'm not talking about anger or blame. I'm talking about that quiet weight that shows up in small moments, the way you apologize before you speak, the way you feel responsible for other people's moods, the way you assume it's your job to make things easier for everyone else. That weight doesn't come from nowhere. It usually comes from a moment when you were expected to handle something that wasn't yours to handle, a moment when someone said, "You're old enough," and stepped back. Maybe no one ever pushed you into a storm. Maybe it looked calmer than that. Maybe it was silence at the dinner table. Maybe it was being told not to make things worse. Maybe it was learning to survive by staying quiet. Those things leave marks too. I spent a long time thinking I needed to forgive harder, be stronger, be more understanding, but none of that answered the real question. Why did I believe I was responsible for what happened to me? That belief didn't protect me, it just kept me stuck. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean reconnecting. It didn't mean pretending the past didn't matter. It meant recognizing that some guilt was never mine to begin with. If you're listening and something in this story feels familiar, I want you to pause, not to fix anything, not to decide anything, just to notice. Notice where you're still carrying weight that doesn't belong to you. Notice how often you explain yourself, how often you minimize your own needs, how often you stay silent to keep things smooth. That silence might have helped you survive once, but it doesn't have to define you now. You don't owe anyone forgiveness to move forward. You don't owe anyone access to your life to prove you're healed. And you don't owe anyone the version of yourself that learned to survive without protection. What you owe yourself is honesty. Honesty about what happened. Honesty about what it cost. Honesty about what you're no longer willing to carry. That's not rebellion. That's clarity. I didn't become free by winning. I didn't become free by being believed. I became free when I stopped assigning myself responsibility for other people's choices. That's a quiet kind of freedom. It doesn't look dramatic, but it lasts. So if you're still holding something that hurts, ask yourself one thing. Is this guilt actually mine? Or did I learn to carry it because no one else would? You don't have to answer out loud. Just don't ignore the question. Sometimes, that's where the real ending begins.